It is exactly this. It's something I wrote, and I say this in the beginning. It's something I wrote for myself, for my 17-year-old self. Um, at the time in the 70s, there was early 70s, late 60s actually, there was very little written on alchemy. I mean, the material that was written on alchemy were whatever little primary sources um, were available. And so actually, I started with the work probably when I was around 17 years old. And I would go into a bookstore called Weisser's in New York City, and they had section on alchemy. And I began reading, looking at this stuff, couldn't afford it, ended up working there. And here I make an apology to Watkins, because after I was working at Weisser's bookstore, they had these wonderful books they were publishing on alchemy. And at lunchtime, these were primary sources, nice editions, hardcover, but I could not afford them at my salary at the bookstore in the 70s. So at lunchtime, I snuck them out and had them, the whole book photocopied, and then had them bound spiral so I could study them, returning the book. So I apologize to Watkins for this. I did eventually end up buying the books when I could, and those spiral bounds went on to some other fellow travelers who were interested in the work. So this is, at the time I wrote this, probably about 30, 40 years of experimenting, of reading primary sources. And then there were some books that came out, primarily Frate Albertus's book, The Alchemist's Handbook, um, kind of spurred a lot of folks to get active in this. And I had stayed out of high school, did not go to college, so I could work at Weiss's to read. And so I could study and then actually start to develop a basic practice. With that, I went back to school to study chemistry, to learn the hands-on practical things and to get a better sense of what the alchemists were doing materially. Okay, this was the thing that was of interest to me. The inner work is there. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but since the book is called Practical Alchemy, let's just focus on that for a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, and I'll just say this about practical outer alchemy and inner alchemy, is they are related, and that the practical leads to the inner. Again, we can bring this up in a Q&A and discussion. So what the book does, or what I tried to do in the book, was write a book for myself. Like, okay, here it is after 30 years of digging around, experimenting, talking to others, setting up a lab, doing the experiments and things. What have I learned? And if I were to do this all over again, where would I start and what would I do? What are the basic theories? Right? What are the basic ideas of alchemy? And what I've come to, and what the book kind of lays a groundwork for, um, is this framework. And it's simply this, is that alchemy is the art and science of bringing something to its final perfection. Anybody who's ever heard me give talks before has heard this a dozen times, but this is a very simple, overarching definition of alchemy, such as an art and a science. It's both, like medicine is an example we can take a look at in terms of it being an art, a clinical side of it, experience, understanding what's happening, and then the scientific aspect of it. Right? And the same thing is true with alchemy. Right? It looks at it from all perspectives, all forms of knowledge, right? All ways of knowing are to be activated and engaged. So this is that part of it, right? The art and science. The something in traditional alchemy, and this is something I get into the book, are the basic material theories, is that metals, right, lead, copper, gold, etc., were on a spectrum, right? With lead being the impure, imperfect, imbalanced, right, form of metal, with gold being at the other end, perfect, nothing can touch it, right? So what alchemy would be doing is taking where nature left off, right? These are the results of elements, fire, air, earth, water, in the earth, influenced by planetary influences that would give rise to this range of metals in the earth. And what the alchemist, the artist, would do would be to enter into this process and then kind of help it along, right? Taking out what's unnecessary and let in moving it along and ending up with a transmutation. So this is the one thing, from imperfect to perfect, bringing something to its final perfection, right? And then the other thing is, to the other extreme, would be the idea of the human soul, right? This idea of us humans as imperfect beings, you know, striving to, and this process of ascent to the one, right? Very hermetic Gnostic ideas there. And this is part of alchemy as well, this inner outer process. And bringing it to its final perfection, right? Bringing it to its end, so to speak. When you think of perfection, perfect, sort of like the final tense in language, right? It's done, it's finished. But I think we also need to think about it in the sense of an artist, right? At what point is the piece done? When is it completed? When is it finished? When is it perfected, right? And so this is what alchemy does. It's a dialogue with nature, a dialogue with the world to make changes in the world. And that might be for medicine, it might be psychological. It has a theory that explains the world and changes in it that in its own theory says can be applied to just about any process that involves change. Right? This is the idea behind it. So all of that in this, right? But it's the theories of alchemy. I mean, if you were to, and you can do it in a few pages, it can be said in just that, a few pages. Once you have the basic concepts there, things start to become clear as to what the alchemists are actually talking about, or how you could read a primary source and start to, it's not even decoded. I mean, in a sense, it's a way of understanding it, you know, having come to understand the language of whatever time period and whatever individual is choosing to use. It's like reading the work of an artist, reading the work of a writer. You understand their voice, you understand the materials they're working with, whether it's language, paint, or what have you, to express their deeper understanding of the universe and perhaps nudging you to change. Right? And that's the thing in alchemy. There's always that element of change, right? That's what it's about. It's taking something from someplace else and moving it to some idea of betterment. And if it's not doing that, it's not really alchemy then. Right? You might be playing along on the surface and all that's good. You know? Many attempts to reach these higher things have resulted in like very useful discoveries like porcelain, et cetera, et cetera. So what I do with this book is start with the very basic, simple theories of it, frameworks of it, and then break it down into basic, practical, very practical things you can do. And it sets it up that way. How to set up a laboratory, where to get glass, just really, really simple, practical. When it says practical, it means practical. But in here, you'll also see where it points to how it starts to link to the inner work. And this combination of things, outer, inner, it's something that the overarching theme, if you were to say, of my work, is that idea, where that shows up, how you work with that, how you explore that. And this is where some of my other work comes into, right, where I explore that idea a bit more. In actuality, Practical Alchemy is volume 1 of a 3-volume process. The whole overarching concept is this idea of poetry of matter, this composition of matter. Right? So just as a poet would compose using elements of words, so an alchemist might compose using the elements of the cosmos. And so so that would be the first part of it. In other words, here is the entry point. This is the concrete. This is where we are. This is where we start. And so starting there, you start to open up other ideas as to what's going on in that flask. And this sometimes borders on chemistry and physics because you'll see things, you go, okay, what's going on in there? A very simple exercise or practice you can do is crystallize something. Get some salt, regular old table salt, and dissolve it in water, let the water evaporate, and let crystals form. And then ask yourself, what are you looking at? Right? Hold it up to the light. There's like atoms, concrete little chunks of something, or maybe not, fields of energy that are somehow hanging in a matrix of water, somehow solid, but yet passing light through it. You do this with a metal like copper, dissolve it in sulfuric acid, right? An oil of vitriol, and you end up with a blue crystal, right? Copper sulfate. And what it is, it's this beautiful matrix of water, sulfur, and copper that lets light pass through, absorbing all the reds and letting the blue come through. What's going on there? What are you seeing? Right? This is where it becomes this dialogue with nature. Right? And that's what the book kind of sets up a very basic groundwork for. Right? So, and its focus is on herbs, right? And this is a tradition, I think, somewhat of a new one, maybe 100 years, if not less. But I do think it's one that has its roots in the past out of just the necessity of it, such as working with herbs as medicine, right? Now, in places or folks who study and teach, it becomes a way of imparting the basic ideas of alchemy and the practices and some of the laboratory stuff using safer materials. You're not going to poison, well, unless you work with poisonous plants, but please don't, that's on you. But really in this practice of working with herbs, you're not really working with anything more dangerous than what you find in a kitchen, which, as we all know, is extraordinarily dangerous. But if you approach it with the same caution, the same mindfulness, and you should be cooking mindfully, with that same mindfulness, it's a pretty safe operation. You don't need anything special. You can get all the special glassware if you start getting serious with this, because it does make setup and takedown easier with stuff. But a little mousing around, like I give some stuff in here as to other possibilities, but I tell you now, mousing around on the web, you'll find other things, other ways, cheaper, interesting stuff you just go pick up at the hardware store and assemble. I can get into some of that, but it'll take time here. And so that's what this does. It gives you all basic tools you might need, right? And with a bibliography, and the bibliography to me in any work is probably the most important thing in any book. In my zine work, and a lot of times I give presentations, it's usually what I start off with. First slide is a bibliography. Because I feel it's important, and I think anybody who's involved in this type of kind of work, let's say, those are the trailheads. Right? You read the book, you go, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. What are their trailheads? Where are they coming from, and where are they going to? Right? And so this is what I do with the bibliography as well. And I try to do that with all bibliographies. I happen to be a major book nerd, if you haven't figured that one out by now. But really, this is what this is all about. It's to kind of get you started. It was to get me started. Right? In other words, imagining myself 17, 18 again, going like this, what is this thing called alchemy, right? And then finding this, it's not like it's all handed to you. It is, but there's some things it's handed to, but you have to do, right? It's like even the most obvious recipe, right? I mean, it's like you do have to bring something to it, right? This type of, you just can't, I mean, you can, but come on, a great alchemical film is Babette's Feast. I'll just say that and leave it there. But it is true about transformation of material things around you and transforming a community. If you've not seen it, go see it. It's like, I think, one of the more perfect alchemical films. There's another key thought I want to bring out here dealing with inner and outer. right? How these two things kind of operate. And you see this more clearly in some of the early Greco-Roman and even the Islamic alchemy, where a text can be understood in two ways. Right? The Emerald Tablet happens to be one of the more, like really a very clear, perfect example of this, where you can find references to almost an identical process that the Emerald Tablet is speaking about, such as circulation and alternation, in these texts from first century alchemical texts. And then you'll find in some of the Gnostic, like Nag Hammadi, you'll find references to the same similar processes. And so what they're speaking of is, this is a universal process, right? This is something that is on an inner spiritual level, things unfold this way. On a material level, things unfold this way. And this is one of the like stronger insights to this. And when you start to see this and understand it as you're looking at some alchemical text, images and texts, something pops out, right? And the analogy I use is stereograms. In a three-dimensional image, you usually use a viewer, or sometimes you'll see it in a book. And if you can kind of like, look at it and fuse the two images together, you can see a 3D image. And so this is what alchemy is like. Right? You'll have one side of, let's say it's a photograph of a field and some people and trees in the background, right? And both images, if you looked at them separately, would be almost identical, right? And you would say one side represents spiritual alchemy, inner alchemy. And you look at it and you go, okay, I see how, and this metaphor is referring to the text, right? I see how that does that. I see what you mean how that is. And then you say, well, it can also be seen as a material, as a practical process. And here's the other image. And you look at that and you go, oh, yeah, I can see how that is too. But when you put those two images together, you have an experience and other information, other relationships that are not in either, right? But are in both. And when they're put together, you get this experience that you cannot explain to somebody who can only see with one eye or only see with the other eye. So it's like asking, really, in 3D vision, which eye is more important, the inner practice or the outer practice? And actually, if you're moving forward or inward, it's actually both. And how this would work, and kind of theoretically, reaches into ideas of Neoplatonic Hermetic practice of theurgy, God work, right? How you would open up a channel, through the deities to the one. And so this is what it would involve. A lot of their purification, Neoplatonic, Greek philosophies, purification practices were geometry. And the purpose of that was, you start on the outside, you understand how triangles, squares all interact and relate, right? And after a point, you could see it here in your head. And this is what they mean, from the concrete to the abstract. You've now moved it inward. And it's the same sort of thing with this practice of material alchemy. As you're doing these things, you're starting to gain insights. You're starting to put together stuff. You know how stuff operates and moves with each other. So this is the poetry of it. This is the composition of these elements, right? That will lead you, and this is what alchemy is. It's an ascent through descent. Right? By descending into matter, opening it up, you are actually, as they would say, opening up the geometries of your soul, harmonizing it with the world geometry, right? The universal, the cosmos. And by doing this, this channel opens. And off, and basically, I guess, off you go. And this is what the alchemy is about. And this practical alchemy is where it starts. And so, following on, Plato, essentially, or Socrates, or actually his teacher Diotima, it's from the abstract to the concrete. I mean, from the concrete to the abstract to the authentic. And this is the ascent. And this is where you start. You start with the material. You start where we are. And this is what alchemy is. all in this handy dandy book that you can get for 16.95. No, but this is the starting point, and it's where any laboratory work, any material work, and this is the other thing with in my years of studying this and working with this is that any activity, any creative act, art, painting, writing, singing, music, whatever, can be used in this process. Right? It can be used as a way of a dialogue with the world and with change. So, and with that is intent, and that again is up to you and on you. You know, so careful what you wish for. No, it's this. It takes place in Denmark or something. This woman who is this master chef from Paris takes place in the 1870s, and I guess because she was on the wrong side with the Paris Commune supporting the revolutionaries, basically gets kicked out or has to leave. Ends up in Denmark in this fishing village where people just eat slop and cold fish, right? So there's the person who ends up helping all the old people and sick people who feeds them get sick. They can't do it. She steps in and they're like, wow, she's good, right? There's a lot of hatred in the village. No one likes her. They're all tight and bitter ass, right? So she wins a lottery. And what she does with that is she buys a lot of good ingredients, but it's more than just ingredients. She knows how to put them together. And she puts on a village feast in her house. And it is amazing. Everybody starts getting drunk on the really good wine, the really good food, and basically all these harsh animosities and backstabbing gets dissolved, and everybody's happy and laughing. Anyway, there it was. Do you need to know? No, I don't think you necessarily need to know. I think what it comes down to in my mind is intent, right? And I think you tend to be if you're working in the material world. I mean, we hear this all the time. Right? I mean, it's like kind of one of those artistic metaphors, or like, wow, there's an alchemy there, right? And that's kind of what it's pointing to. It's saying that there's something more involved that affects us, right? That it's not just adding ingredient A, ingredient B, ingredient D, and this is what you get, right? It recognizes that there's some kind of interaction, and in that interaction and dialogue amongst all, there's a transformation and possibly a transmutation. And so this is what I think, we all do this, right? We may not think of it this way. And this is part of what it is too, is kind of recognizing it, that we have these sorts of, inborn abilities to do things, right? So no, I don't think it's like, yeah, you can call yourself all this types of stuff, and that gets to be kind of problematic. But no, someone who is working in the world and trying to do something better for it, yeah, you can say they might be actually not even knowing it, but working with some of the basic principles that alchemy articulates. Right? Into it, yeah, because they go into it going like, let's not give her the satisfaction, right? That's it, and that's it. I'm sorry, good food and alcohol. I'm sorry, you know what I mean? That kind of gets to anybody. It is all of this that penetrates through. Right? It can penetrate that cold-hearted, that stone, that other thing that is resisting change, right? It implies that. And hopefully, in a sense, it's more about a bringing out than an imposition on, right? All held their ground, right? Because they're like, oh, don't enjoy that, Lou. You look like you're enjoying it. No, it worked. It's like, yeah, you don't want to impose, but I think it was just, I know this is getting like, but it's very good because it is a really good example. It's in the movie. It's like you get a sense of it is as much for her own joy, right? Her own, like, you know what? I've always wanted to do this. Let's have a blowout. I'm only going to do this once, and you know what? You guys are the audience. But I also think too through the film, it's like she does see how the food is affecting folks, right? This type of a thing. And so I think that's like, one of the great benefits of kind of, I don't know, what is it called? Self-interested altruism, I guess, something like that, where it's like, you're doing it for yourself, but there's a whole lot of folks that are really benefiting. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right? So Yes, yes. And you know something, this is something, it's like it's not so much secrecy as it is a silence, right? And I think the secrecy kind of like seals the silence, like, okay, I'm gonna do this, as opposed to and I think it's mostly that. There's traditionally it's always emphasized, and a lot of it has to do with trade secrets and letting the idea of some dangerous information out, right? Like you just don't want. Some of it was self-preservation. I mean, actually, because if someone got word that you could do this, and this is history, this is documented. If someone got word that you could do this, you might be invited to the king's castle and given a lab and click, right? And this has happened. So there's part of that, but this goes further back, right? This is an idea that goes to Greco-Roman times and even earlier. And it is this idea of sort of a knowledge that is so kind of subtle or so deep and intense that if actually said, um, could be misunderstood and could be dangerous, right? Anywhere through an insight such as, you know, there is no God, but you're kind of hung up on the first part, could get you killed, right? Even though that might be a valid, you know, kind of negative theological insight into the nature of the universe. But so there are these kinds of ideas. There's also an idea too that if someone were to see you doing this, and this is what Zosimo says to his partner Theosebia, because she asks him, what's up with all the secret? And he says, well, if people saw this or thought this, it would be no different than glass making, right? That they would not understand what the inner process is here. All they would just see you doing is making glass. And that, by the way, is a hint as to some of the things they were working with and doing. They were really working with metallurgical material processes, but it had this initiatic meditative process. And if you read the earlier work, it's in there. It starts to be rediscovered again or played with in the 17th century after alchemy has its split, and you see it really kind of focusing on either a spiritual or a material alchemy. So anyway, this is there's many reasons for the secrecy. You know, anywhere from just, you know, pragmatic self-preservation to preserving proprietary ideas to a spiritual, you know, silence that allows the connections to be made. Right? Yes, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, the books can be written in a way. I mean, if like, yes, they are. They're impossible to read. This is intentional. Because it was the only way like communication could happen and ideas kind of worked out or tried without putting it, you know, pearls before swine, so to speak. And it was a way of saying what you knew, but a way of provoking what others knew. So in the 17th century, especially with printing and publication, was a heyday of alchemical writing and publications. So there is that part of it. Yeah, I mean, the other thing to consider is the time period these folks are living, writing in, right? There were a lot of people literally losing their heads over variations on, you know, what particular sect they identified with. So there was, and this is what the Rosicrucians, I think, and people like Giordano Bruno were trying to kind of transcend these religious boundaries and kind of go for a primary, sort of a primary source of it. So secrecy for them was absolutely, and there I think it is a bit of self-preservation, just because it's like, you know, look what happened to Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake, right? It's like, okay, got the message. You know, outside in Prague and outside of the Jesuit, they would just, you know, just for demonstrations, flay people, you know, who, you know, kind of went against the theme. So there's that, right? And so you will have, I mean, the idea of the Rosicrucians is really a like 17th century. It's a, you know, from the 16th century writing. I don't know, and I can't really speak too much on it because I never dug into and studied them directly. if you know what I mean. Not like I would alchemical. You come across it because they're sort of alchemy adjacent. Um, you'll find, you'll find Rosicrucians, like Michael Meyer, for instance, uh, the personal physician to Emperor Rudolph II, wrote many books on alchemy. Atalanta Fugiens is this remarkable emblem book. So you have these writers writing about it, talking about it, but there's hidden brotherhood essentially, and I think some of that was attempted to become an actual material thing, but I also think it was recognizing basically what we are doing here, right? The hidden college, right? It's like I used to think about that when I would give talks here in the city, because a lot of times it would just be a local bookstore and they would have a room next door that was the old storage place for the plumbing shop. They cleared out, set up a bunch of chairs, and that was it. Like 20, 30 people would show up and you would talk and we would talk. And that's what it felt like. It felt like there's this invisible college that all you had to do is put out the word through the grapevine and everyone would show up. And it's like this in a digital version. So I have a feeling that some of this idea, was picked up. And then also the whole Masonic tradition, which was there, which was an actual organization. So it's an area I find very fascinating, but it then starts to kind of pose its own fascination to me on like 18th century organizations and symbolism and special handshakes and things like this, right? As far as their alchemy goes, it really starts to develop more or less in the 20th century. Right? And that's with Frate Albertus, who was one of the branches of Rosicrucianism and took it as one on his mission to kind of revive the practice of alchemy and bring it out into the world. So I don't know how many people know of that, but this is one of the aspects of an alchemical tradition in Rosicrucianism. But again, I don't know too much about it as a thing, if you know what I mean. So it's a mixed thing, because I would say yes, but I would have to qualify that greatly by saying yes, but not from a 21st, 20th, 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th, 12th, 13th century perspective, right? What it involves is an unbelievable, sophisticated metallurgy, right? That had a priestcraft around it. So it's like right there, it's like you look at some things, and I'm thinking right offhand, there's statues of Anubis, right, which has gold and black. And that black is like, if you ever go to a museum, try to find some of these objects that have this black, and it's called in niello. It's a silver sulfide, and it's made in a certain way. And the recipe was lost for a while, but somewhere in the Renaissance, it was rediscovered and then kind of forgotten about. Making this now is a test of goldsmithing. It's like, if you can manage this, because it takes a dry powder and it's a certain type of heating and it's a certain type of composition of silver and sulfur, that it's just like everything has to be just right. And then when it does, it fills in all these cracks and can be sanded, polished, the whole thing. But then it is matte black and it absorbs all light. So to have this against gold, it's an astounding piece of work. And to go, okay, this is what, 3000 BC? All right, this they knew what they were doing. So we have an understanding of alchemy as changing lead into gold. Much of what is chemistry, and I wouldn't even call it chemistry because this still is a priestcraft around this. The metal, gold, was considered the skin of the gods, right? Now let that sit for a little bit and go back to the idea I had mentioned earlier about alchemy, ascent through descent, right? It implies that within here is an infinite deity, right? What does that mean? So they work with metal. They did metal, right? But was that level was priestcraft, right? It were priests who did this. So there's an element of cosmic theology in that, whichever that might be. And the thing is, I never got deep into this. Right? Again, for me, there are two books of alchemy, right? Or that refer to this. One, it's the actual literal printed books by people who worked in alchemy and did it. And the other one, my interactions and dialogue with the world. Those are my two books. Everything else, if it's not coming from one or the other, is fascinating speculation, and I want to hear it. I want to hear all your sources, and then can we do some work with this, right? Beyond that, it's just gets to be some very interesting ideas, but you know, that's what they are. I can come up with 50 of them if you wish. However, it is this that merges with a lot of the philosophies of Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Buddhism, right? Around 300 BC, Buddhists are proselytizing in Alexandria, right? 250 BC or so, documented. So there are discussions going on here. There's a great cross-fertilization that's going on. And so there is this like theurgic aspect of matter providing a channel. Right? I think anybody who's worked on anything enough for long enough, it starts to show up in your dreams. And if you dream enough, eventually that dream becomes lucid. You become aware of it. And once that happens, okay, you just ascended to ascend. You go do what you want, right? Listen to who shows up and maybe perhaps some directions that are given. But it is this dynamic intermix. So I don't really believe that the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, 2000 BC, 1000 BC or so, had a concept of transmutational alchemy. If you want to take a look at something that is like Egyptian and was found, it's like out of a movie, was found in a mummy's case held by the mummy, who was a physician. It's a combination of the Stockholm Papyrus and the Leiden Papyrus are believed to be one book that was found and then divvied up between two collections. But that book was a book of recipes, and it was found with the mummy. That book's recipes track very closely with, I mean, it's basically pharmacological, magical, and then what we would call alchemical, except it doesn't talk about transmutation. It talks about making copper look as good as gold so as to would trick, you know, a goldsmith, right? You could do it that well. So you have all these technologies that start to come in, fusing with philosophies that say, okay, we will use this as a meditative. This will be a philosopher's gold, not the gold of the fools, right? Not ordinary gold. We've put these metals through a philosophical process and have come to a deeper understanding. So this is where, like, Alexandria really does become this cross-fertilization of everything. It is this thing that evolves, and it evolves out of, I mean, it's just give us a chance and we'll go for it. And this is what you see, really. It's like different ideas, different concepts, different things kind of coming together, interactions, and folks going, let's try it. And then it gets written down, it gets articulated, and it gets tried again. And it's found, you know, maybe this works. So it's a long way around, and it's highly qualified, you know, what is the influence and what is the impact of ancient Egypt. But I'm also, you know, just want to keep it real, right? Because there's, you know, I got other things to do, you know? Well, here we go. Yeah. I mean, it's like nobody knows what they're talking about. I mean, everybody's on the, I mean, when you read all this material, you feel, or at least I do, right? These are, you get this, you define perfect. What does that mean? Okay. You know, you'll end up murdering each other eventually. You know, that's what humans end up doing. No, you wear your hat this way. You know, you don't wear your hat that way. You know, you enter the temple this way, not that way, right? And this is what was happening in Europe and happens over and over again. But this is in the 17th century, and this is what these philosophers were trying to like. Let's move back past that. Right? Here's what I think. I mean, since alchemy's claim is it's describing ongoing, changing creative processes, right? It will apply anywhere. And since what is composed and structured, and he's developing ideas, and then he comes across these alchemical texts that go, well, they're kind of saying the same thing, right? Metaphorically speaking, Jung's basic idea, as I understand it, is compensation. It's like if you're too much of one, you need to kind of balance out. And in doing this whole balancing thing, you can actualize yourself as a full human being. Right? I mean, in a thumbnail balancing of opposites, it's a union of opposites that creates a third theory, and he's applied it to the object of the human psyche to enable understanding, healing, growth in the human psyche, in the human condition. I see that no different than an alchemist saying, okay, I'm going to take these metals, do this, do that, transform it, and have this pill, and I'll give it to this person who's dying of this incurable cancer and cure them of this cancer. Why is one an alchemist and one the other not? It's the, I put this in quotation, is so big he takes up the whole room, right? You can't see past him in terms of the alchemical writings or what the alchemical writings are actually trying to say, right? Because he's taken it and really worked it. And he is of an inner work, which makes sense because the alchemists are saying that, right? Except they're not talking psyche. Right? Then you go, okay, what do you mean by soul and what do you mean by self? Oh, that's another 10-year conversation. But this is, if you put Jung aside, and then you take a look at the alchemical text and what the inner work is saying, which Jung speaks of, dream work, which Jung speaks of, but what Jung does not speak of are the awakened dreams, lucid dream. Mentioned somewhere some patient awakening in a dream and being aware. But I've done some readings and study and practice with lucid dreaming, and I've never seen a quote. I've never seen a quote from Freud, and I've never seen a quote from Jung concerning lucid dreaming. And I don't see how you can be discussing any kind of material practice that involves an inner work that somehow, when you know that's kind of what they're talking about. It's like, again, a conversation with Zosimos and Theosebia. She's running into, how do I do this? I'm not quite well, meet me in a vision. It's like, well, how do we do that? And he goes, well, don't you, basically it's like, well, don't you remember what Hermes said? You know, or destroy those things within you. And he goes, Father, do I? He goes, yes. You have restlessness first. And he goes on and names it. The alchemical text doesn't get into the details. It just says, meet me in a vision. How do I do that? Well, you know the 12. And it's like, right back. You know what I mean? And so this is the thing. With Jung, you would never see that, right? He analyzes that work, the virtue lessons by Zosimos in one of his alchemical texts, but never mentions that line, right? And that line is, as Zosimos is kind of working through this problem in the laboratory, he's seeing what's going on. He's describing it in the writing. And he says, and saying those things, I went to sleep. And then in the dream, a priest appeared, and I mounted the 7 steps, and I saw within there a red man devouring himself, cutting himself, and I woke in a shock. The technique right there. Jung doesn't talk about it. Jung analyzes the dream, but I'm telling you, there's a lot more there when you go back to the primary sources and just understand, what are they talking about? Where are they? A lot more there for you, right? I think his greatest alchemical book, because this is an alchemical book, is his Red Book, right? And what I love about this is you see the process visual, right? Because what he's doing, and this is the process, he adheres to dogma. right? He is replicating the manuscripts, right? With, if you're familiar with the images, if you look at the book and just identical formulaic copying of like 15th century manuscripts, the illuminated letters, the fraktura type calligraphy, as he's going on and expressing ideas. As he's making, as an artist, I go, enough of this shit. I got pages to go. I'm going to loosen this up a bit. You know what I mean? But there's also a deeper insight that's going on. He no longer needs that structure. He's seeing it on his own terms. And now he's giving it his own visual explanation or expression of this. This is what I mean by using the art form as the matter. And this is where it's very explicitly alchemical to me, is this dialogue. You don't even have to read. This is also something you do with an alchemical book, is not necessarily read it, even if it doesn't have pictures. It's just, it's a weird film thing I have. Like I watch the film I do forwards and backwards in high speed sometimes, just for there's images in there. Go through the book itself in the way it was intended and see if some patterns start. It's just another way of looking at things. So this is, you know, it's an ongoing thing. And this is what Jung's, you know, kind of Red Book just really expresses, you know. It's not, anyway. And he's a psychonaut, you know, he's going where no one's gone before. And you see it. He's like, you know, he's on the edge of going mad at times, you know, like really just kind of like losing it. When things start showing up, you know what I mean? It's quite intense. It's like, where are the boundaries here? You know, what has just happened? You know, so anyhow, that's my take on him. I have, and it's like, you know, if you're a practical alchemist, you get really pissed at him. You know what I mean? Because it's like, no, come on, man. You know, no, they're working with stuff. It's the doctor and the doctor. You know, one is a material making pills, and the other's, you know, fucking with your head, so to speak. Sorry. So that's where I do 5 translations of the Emerald Tablet, like 5 of the earliest, 3 from Latin, 2 from Arabic, and do an analysis. Practical, or what I used to still do, affectionately called the Weisser's book. It's because I had such a long, I mean, it's, you know, a long old history with that, you know. Yeah, anyhow, that's a time for another story. that's another show. But that's what it was. It was to get this grounded, get people working, and then eventually do the second, which would then start to explore this link between the inner and outer. So the second book is actually an alchemical book, right? Where the first one is about and getting started. Second one is starts talking more about the Islamic and the Western alchemy, dealing with the quintessence, and then some drinkable gold, and, you know, oh, some other cool stuff. So, and it's called Alchemy, the Poetry of Matter. And that is not called volume 2, but in my mind, a book form. It's objects, working from alchemical materials, creating, you know, like, you know how Egypt, this is where it gets philosophically Egyptian, in that, like statues are actually words, right? Where a statue is carved into the form of the word of a god, right? When you see a character sitting holding the god, right? So I was playing with this idea of how objects are actually symbols of their own selves that point inward. Anyway, we're going to get deep into weird shit here, but I won't go there. I played with this with the alchemy, turned it into a sort of an alchemical emblem like this, but made out of the objects, and call it a page. So I have these constructions, let's say, pages of images, photographs, I don't know. So that's the volume 3, where it gets really abstract, if you know what I mean. I was like, and then I think, oh no, that just sounds a little, I don't know. I have to do a little bit more consideration environmentally on that one before I go down that route. But, you know, artistically, in terms of having weird things that can be protected in a way, you know. Anyhow, this gets into abstract ideas of many things. Another topic for a talk. So Yeah, this is all like old school zines. These are from primary, so get to the heart of it, but I will never write a book on it. But if you're curious, what what that will do is give you if I was going to write a book on this. So I do things on artificial life, the golem, on talismans, on different time systems. Animation of statues is about a Neoplatonic thing. They're really cool. And what's very satisfying about them is I will never write a book about it, right? Although it needs to be a book, but this is for you folks. You know what I mean? It's like to stimulate interest in it. And one of the most satisfying things that happened was concurrently, it didn't cause it, but concurrently, Wing was already happening. But check them out. I mean, it's a thing like the golem, animation of statues, et cetera, et cetera. And Watkins carries them. And it's best if you're overseas. Believe me, the postage is insane coming from the States to Europe. So check to see what's available there. And then in the States, you know, my website, Ouroboros, William Kiesel, all these folks, all these. My thing is, go to your local bookstore, right? You Alexandrians, all right? It's you allowed people to read, right? Like you don't kick them out if they're reading a book. I mean, maybe if they're causing problems with other customers, perhaps, but lifesaver for me, right? Having a bookstore like Weisser's at 14, 15, it was like, I was there in the library, but the library didn't have the books I wanted, right? And so going there, it was, let me put it this way, get me on, like, if you keep thinking this was the right path, yeah, you could imagine what other paths were being offered, right? So, yeah, for real. And this is the thing, these physical locations, it's like, it's where the interactions occur. I have people I met there I'm still friends with, and this is 50 years ago, right? It was me going there that started me working there, and then me working there that I started writing. And then after I wrote the book, Weiss's contacted me and said, you want to be involved in it? Because how Watkins was involved. You guys really, as a teenager, you guys were heroes, right? I'm seriously, primary sources of alchemy, and not just, it was the Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, it was the collected works, primary, the Turba Philosophorum. I mean, this is a key Arabic work translated into Latin. 16, I know of this, and there they are, and they're like books. You know what I mean? It was a proper book, right? You looked at, and it, smelled important, as I like. These people are publishing the real deal, right? And it was like, all right. So it was Weisser's and Watkins. Believe it or not, you ne'er-do-wells, right? We're like high up on the list of like, okay, who the publishers are, who's writing and who's interested in this stuff. And it's important. Everybody out there goes to the bookstores. I bet you when you go to a strange town and you're in Europe, and even if you do not speak the language, who cares? Where's the alchemy section? And they go, oh, is that what you speak? And it's like, no. It says, right? You want to know. You want to hear things. You want the contacts. It's where are the trailheads. And just to reiterate one more time, KhepriPress.com. Just saying, sign up for the list. You never know what will show up anyway. I promise no kitten videos, right? I love kittens, but I will not send anything other than, me. I do minor email exchange, but reach out to me if you have some questions, and I will always follow up. What I can't deal with, people who know me know my head explodes over small type on screens. I get migraines. And so that I want to answer, but I can't answer. However, should you ever find yourself in New York City, drop me a line. I'll meet you for a coffee. We could talk deep shit all day long. So